Well, throughout history, you see many examples of societies outgrowing their own religions. If you look at the ancient world, you can see where Christianity rose up, and you might ask, well, why did Christianity rise up? And it's very simple. The old Greco Roman paganism did not fulfill people anymore, and people became jaded of it and bored of it. People only made sacrifices to the gods out of politeness more than anything else. And so the ancient world was in this transitionary phase where they were trying to find out what new mythology can fill the void. We're tired of the paganism. And so all of these cults cropped up and they fought each other, and Christianity was the one that won out. And so that became instituted as the new religion of the West and of the Roman Empire, and then that continued for about 1700 years. And then when you get to the 18th century, you see the Enlightenment. And with the Enlightenment, there was this undermining of traditional religious ideas of Christianity. And when you get to the 19th century, it's even worse for religion, where you see things like Darwinism. And I would say that Darwinism was really the thing that really destroyed Christianity more than anything else, because Darwinism is not only on a factual basis contrary to Christianity, but the values that can be extrapolated out of Darwinism are opposite that of the moral values that can be extrapolated out of the Christian moral code. So, if you look at the modern West, we're in a very similar phase that the ancient world was in, because we don't really have a metaphysics, we don't really have a story about the world, and so people often get sucked up by radical political ideologies because people are looking for some sense of meaning, some idea that explains the world, and we just have none of that. And modern society is in a very strange contradiction, and I think a fatal contradiction, where we basically subscribe to not the metaphysics. We do not subscribe to the metaphysics. We have done away with the metaphysics of Christianity, but we still cling to the moral values of Christianity, which were extrapolated out of the metaphysics. We still cling to those and take those completely for granted, where these ideas such as the intrinsic value of all people and the equality in the intrinsic value of all people, and the moral worth of the downtrodden, and pity for the weak, and compassion for the weak, and these sorts of things, these grew all of these grew out of Christianity, and these are still taken completely for granted in the Western world, whereas the metaphysics is not. If you said, we need more equality, everybody's going to agree with you. But if you said, we need more equality because God says so, nobody's going to agree with you. People are going to be like, no, equality, people treat equality as if it's a good in and of itself, because we still largely operate in a Christian value structure. So the metaphysics is dead. We got rid of that like 200 years ago, 300 years ago. But the moral structure still holds on very, very strongly. And so this is a contradiction, because the moral code grew out of the metaphysics, but we've done away with the metaphysics. So you would think the moral code would also have to be done away with, but modern society not only does not confront this contradiction, but it tries to shy away from confronting this contradiction. So you can see, our entire society is basically just one big singular attempt to distract ourselves from the absurdities of the things that we believe. And this is one of them, one of the bigger ones, where we drowned ourselves in movies and video games and porn and social media and all these things. And we do so because we don't want to have to acknowledge the fact that the things that we believe are just absurd to a schizophrenic degree. And so, this is why Nietzsche famously said that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Because what he meant was, our new modes of thinking have so fundamentally undermined our old modes of thinking that our old modes of thinking are destined to collapse. And so all of Western civilization had been built on this idea of God. And so when the Enlightenment came along and when natural science came along and blew apart this idea, the foundation is ruptured. And if the foundation is ruptured, then everything built upon the foundation must necessarily collapse. So Nietzsche is in some sense an intellectual engineer, where he recognized that this house of cards was unsustainable. And so we have this contradiction, and it was Darwinism that really did it. I think Darwinism really did Christianity in, because Darwinism is not only contrary to Christianity on a factual basis, but also the sort of moral structure, the moral values that you could extrapolate out of Darwinism run completely contradictory to that of the moral values of Christianity, where Darwinism, if you wanted to lay down Darwinism as a moral framework, it would promote things much more similar to the Indo-European moral code of the ancient pagans, where it would promote ambition, pride, strength, conquest, glory, great action, these sorts of things, which seems to run contrary to the Christian focus on pity for the weak, compassion, subservience to God, humility, these sorts of things. And so, yeah, this contradiction doesn't make sense. And Nietzsche was really the only one who realized it. And he realized that 140 years ago, and today we still haven't come to terms with it. We've tried to ignore it. We've tried to, silently discard the truth claims of Christianity while maintaining the value structure of Christianity. And that contradiction is untenable. So the West is in this place where it's an existential choice. We can either cut adrift completely from the Christian tradition, much the same way that the ancient world cut adrift from the pagan tradition, and instead we could, essentially try to become gods ourselves, which I think would be not only the best, but probably our only choice. Or we could turn around and just run full sprint into the arms of these ancient myths, these ancient religions, which doesn't seem productive because it's kind of cowardice. It's cowardly, in the same way that a little child runs, and hides under his mother's skirt to shrink away from the responsibility of the age, to shrink away from the challenge of the age, and to hide beneath the covers of religion is tantamount to intellectual cowardice. And so I do not at all support that. I think that we have to become gods ourselves. I think that's the only thing that's left to us. Where the only thing that's going to fill the void that God has left is man himself. And some people wonder, well, how can we do that? How do we become gods ourselves? That sounds so vague. And, well, think about it like this. There are some people who will protest that without God, there is no meaning to life. And so that tells us something. That tells us something very important, where what they've basically said with that statement is a qualifying prerequisite that constitutes a God is the creation of meaning. Can you create meaning? And so you'll also hear people say, well, without God, there's no good or evil. And this is the famous Dostoevsky quote, without God, everything is permissible. And that's interesting because good and evil are value structures. Good and evil are not really factual things in the same way that evolution or, cytoplasm is. It's a value claim. And so what these two statements show us is that the two qualifying prerequisites for being a god, the two things that constitute a god, is the ability to create meaning and values, those two things. And if man can rise to the historical occasion and confront this internal contradiction, if he can confront this abyss of nihilism which has completely overwhelmed him and will continue to overwhelm him unless he can confront it, then he can become his own God. If he can confront it forthrightly and say, I'm going to create my own meaning, and I'm going to create my own values. And that's what Nietzsche told us. And he was right.